So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center, Bard College. We are coming to the end of the first part of Hannah Arendt's last book, The Life of the Mind. This first part is called Thinking, and it's an attempt to think about what it is we do when we think. It's an attempt to think about thinking, and as such, it's an attempt to do a bit of philosophy, which Arendt says is something she usually avoids. It's her last effort. Why is she doing it? Well, we talked about that. She offers two reasons. One, potentially practical, ethical, insofar as she wants to ask the question of, can we think in a way that, or does thinking, can thinking in some way contribute to the prevention of evil in the modern world? And the second is to add to her thinking about the human condition. And after thinking about action, and the vita activa in the modern world, ask about the place of thinking, or the vita contemplativa, which for her is not inactive. And so this first volume on the life of the mind, on thinking, has well, where has it led us? Well, we're in the final part, which she calls Where Are We When We Think, part 4. And she begins it by saying, you can't expect me to offer some conclusions, because there's no real conclusion. There's no answer to the question of what is thinking, or where are we when we think, or what makes us think, or what are the mental activities that we have. All of these are not meant to be answered in a definitive way. She says to do so would be to contradict the very premise, in a sense, or argument of her essays, her attempts, insofar as for her, thinking is an activity, and it's particularly an activity that has no end outside of itself. It is its own end, and it is like being alive. We think because in thinking, we are alive. We are. And there's a contradiction, because if in thinking it's because we're alive and we are, it's also the case that, as she here references in the epigraph by Valéry, sometimes I think, and at times I am, such that when I think, I am not. So here's a fundamental contradiction in Arendt's approach, not a contradiction that is to show that she's wrong, but to show that there's a profound thought going on, which is that on the one hand, thinking is being alive. Therefore, thinking is being. On the other hand, when I think, I am not. And what does that mean? I am not when I think. Well, it doesn't mean that when you think you're not alive. It doesn't mean when you think you are not something, because you are, but you are not in the world. You are not part of the everyday, ordinary world. And so thinking, in a sense, jumps us, elevates us, transports us to another way of being in the world. And thus another place. Where is that place? Well, she's going to offer an answer to some degree, which is not much of an answer, because the answer is nowhere. So when you are thinking, and you are not in the world, you are nowhere. And that at least is one preliminary answer that she's going to offer. you'll see, I'm sure you've seen in the reading, she then offers another metaphor, another answer, which is that in thinking, we are in the gap, the battlefield between past and future. So these are going to be different metaphors. So there's not here an attempt to provide answers to the question of what is thinking or why we think or where we are when we think, but to think through the perplexities of it once again. She does say she's going to offer a quick review of what she's done so far to bring us up to pace. And in that review, she focuses on 3 steps, right? The first step is to remind us that thinking is always out of order, right? This is a fundamental idea that she has pressed on since the beginning of the book, 200 pages earlier, which is that when we think, we interrupt the daily processes, we interrupt activities. The classic imagination of this is Socrates, who often is walking down the street and then just stops, and 20 hours later, day later, is still found there, not moving, thinking. And this is an image, Arendt says, of thinking. The person who sort of interrupts the daily activities here, or someone sitting at their desk and you see them thinking, and then you come back 6 hours later and they're still on their desk thinking. And that's for Arendt, a clear sign of interrupting the daily activities, but also somebody who simply doesn't act like when everyone else is. If everyone else goes to a protest and somebody stands on the outside of it and looks and thinks, that too interrupts the daily activities. And such an act is out of order. And that's one aspect of the argument about thinking. A second aspect, a second part of the argument that she's made, that she focuses on in this sort of review, is that thinking is manifested in what she calls authentic semblances. We spoke a fair bit about this early on, where she talks about it, but the idea here is that we talk about things like the thinking ego, which is one. What is this thinking ego? On the one hand, it doesn't exist. I mean, who's ever seen it? And yet there's something, she says, authentic about it. It reflects, or it manifests, an authentic experience that when I think, to some degree, I am outside of reality. I am nowhere. I'm in this sort of abstract realm, and the thinker, as opposed to the doer, or the thinking ego as opposed to the body, and thus the two world theory of Descartes and many others, that I am on one hand thinking and the other hand material, is for her not true, but authentic in a sense of it's something that is meaningful to us, even though it doesn't, there's no actual real distinction between the thinking ego and the material body or the material world. And so we have to deal with the fact that even though it's a semblance, it's meaningful. The third review topic, she says, is that thinking withdraws from the world. Again, something we've talked a lot about. And now what she sort of adds, although I think she's mentioned it before, but now focuses our attention on, is that thinking is thus homeless. There's a homelessness to thinking, and that when you are absent and you're withdrawn from the world, you are everywhere and nowhere. And as a result, you focus on generalities. She makes an interesting and I think important distinction between concepts and generalities. She's not saying that when you think in concepts, that you think in abstract universals, but you do think in generals. You know, when you speak about a house, you're talking about a house in general, devoid of the particulars. You don't have to have a full-on concept that's logical and sketched out, but you do have to understand sort of a general concept that is not connected to any particular house. And she here cites Aristotle, who, unlike Socrates, when he was threatened with treason, left. Socrates, of course, stayed and said, Athens is my home. I'm not going to go into exile, and I will rather be killed and die than leave where I am at home. Socrates, in this sense, while he was the thinker qua thinker for Arendt, is in some ways still tied to a place. Whereas Aristotle, when he's threatened with this, says, see you later, and heads to Macedonia, and says, I can think anywhere. And that's and in a way, Aristotle is thus the sort of culmination of this thinking school of the Greeks. Finally, we come back to Valéry and the remark, this is on 201, when we think we are not, and which he says would be right, would be right, not that it is right, but would be right if our sense of realness were entirely determined by our spatial existence. And here she brings up the two concepts of space and time. So it is the case that thinking is homeless and it is not in the world. But that doesn't mean we are not, because thinking is not simply spatial. There's also a temporality to time. Temporality to thinking. And thus, even though we can desense through thinking and despatialize through thinking, we still are in some way in the world. Thus, we are in the sense of in the real world, in a temporal way, in a way that connects to time. And that becomes the focus of the next chapter, chapter 20, the gap between past and future. Now, I know many of you have read a fair bit of Arendt and know that this is in some sense a reprinting with some changes of part of the introduction to the book Between Past and Future, which had been written much earlier. So this is an idea, the gap between past and future, that she continues to hold on to for almost 20 years as a guiding idea of what she means by thinking. It's based on the reading of two parables primarily, but mainly one, the Kafka parable, He. But also she brings in the parable by Nietzsche. The parable, which I'm not going to rehearse for you, but it's basically that there are two forces: the past, which starts at the beginning and comes towards the now, and the present, which starts in the indefinite future and comes towards the now, meet at the place where he is, or I am, or you are, where some man is, some person is, and thus the now is for her the the expression of where I am, where you are, where he is. Nietzsche makes a similar, offers a similar parallel in Also sprach Zarathustra, where the now, the Augenblick, the Augenblick, the glimpsing moment, is where the past and the present intersect at the place of man. A few things that Arendt wants to emphasize about these parables in her attempt to ask the question of where are we when we think, which now is going to require not a spatial answer and not a bodily answer, but as she calls it, a temporal answer. And the answer, in one sense, is we're in a battlefield, right? A battlefield. A gap, a rupture. And this battlefield, she says, for Kafka, is the metaphor for man's home on earth. This is on the top of 205. The point is that man is in the middle in this battle. Man is in the middle in this battlefield where the two forces of past and future clash at where man stands. Man, she says, lives in this in-between. This in-between is a temporal, not a spatial idea. And what he calls the present is a lifelong fight against the dead weight of the past, driving him forward with hope, and the fear of a future whose only certainty is death, driving him backward towards the quiet of the past. So the past, the dead weight, what Nietzsche in his parable calls the stone of the past. Why is it a stone? Because the past is that which we cannot change. It's what we are powerless. It's the past is the greatest impediment to human freedom and human power. And as such, because we can't control the past, it is a dead weight, and it drives us forward. For Nietzsche, what he says is that the past is what makes man, infuriates man, and makes him struggle and scrape and whatever, and he needs to master the past. And the only way he can do it, because you can't actually change the past, George Orwell notwithstanding, is to will the past as that which you actually will it to be, and wish and will that the past is exactly how you willed it to be, and thus not be angry at the past, but in a sense affirm the past. And this is what Nietzsche calls the eternal return of the same, the will to power, which is that you will that the past always is as it was, and that it was as you wanted it to be. And thus you assert your power over the past by affirming it as your own will. Man lives in this in-between, in this battleground of the past and the future. This place, this temporal place, right? It's not a spatial place. This temporal space of who man is for Arendt troubling for us because it is so outside the ordinary, outside what she calls the sequence of ordinary life. Ordinary life has a kind of spatiality to it. We move through space, we move through we move from here to there, but in thinking in this battlefield, we are in this weird nowhere, which is temporal and is a gap. And this gap, she says, only applies to the thinking ego, right? It doesn't apply to our bodily self or our everyday lives. In our everyday lives, we're not in this gap. We're only there when we're thinking. And thus the thinking ego, which again, we remind ourselves is what she calls an authentic semblance. The thinking ego is not the same thing as ourself. It's something different. It's this otherworldly, outside of the ordinary, outside of our body, in nowhere, in the battlefield, in the gap, thinking ego, which is a semblance, is not true. There is no real thinking ego, and yet it's authentic. It's an experience, and it's there. Time and the body and everyday life will interrupt this experience of the thinking ego, because the thinking ego is not real, but it is meaningful. And for Kafka, the final meaning of his parable, as Arendt reads it, is that this thinking ego, which is in this gap, becomes and dreams to be a spectator, dreams to be an umpire, dreams to elevate himself up above the forces and be the judge of them. And in a sense, become the objective spectator or judge of history. Arendt says that as brilliant as Kafka's parable is, and she clearly thinks it's amazingly brilliant, she thinks it needs a correction, as she calls it. And the correction that she adds is that instead of jumping out of the fighting line and jumping out of the world altogether, she says the trouble with Kafka's metaphor is that by jumping out of the fighting line, which he does, and out of this world, he jumps out of the world altogether and judges from outside, though not necessarily from above. What is this outside, right? Moreover, if it is the insertion of man that breaks up the indifferent flow by giving it an aim, namely himself, the being who fights it, and if through the insertion to the indifferent time stream is articulated, she says, man's present causes the stream of time to deflect. And so what she wants to argue is that instead of jumping out and above, not necessarily from above, but out and out of time and out of the world, she wants to correct Kafka here and says, what man does is not jump outside of the spirit, outside of this, into a gap that's nowhere above. She says that what man does is, in standing at the meeting of these two forces, the confluence of the past and the future, which have their purpose and aim in man, he deflects them. He's like a deflector shield. They come in, he's there, and they sort of deflect. And this deflection, this disruption, means that man is not some passive object in the stream of forces, right? Not some passive object that gets that gets tossed about by the waves or by these forces. But he is, she writes at the bottom of 207 to 208, a fighter who defends his own presence and thus defines what otherwise might be indifferent to him as his antagonists, the past and the future. And so he's not out of the world. He's not beyond the world. He is in this battleground. I mean, that's the real impact of Arendt's statement here. And she offers this drawing, which she uses in also in Between Past and Future. I'm sure you all have it. It's on page 208 in your texts, but it's this drawing where you have the past and the future. And here's that moment, the present with man. And as they come in, they deflect, and a parallelogram, a diagonal comes out. And the difference is that while the future and the past start somewhere and end in man, someplace definite, here, this new line starts in the present, but ends infinitely. It has no end. And this is a metaphor for thinking and for freedom, the activity of thought and freedom. And it's this activity of thought which is infinite and which is free and is a third force that enters the world, namely man's freedom to think, which she says is the perfect metaphor for the activity of thought. It's this diagonal, this third force. What's important again is that we not, unlike in Kafka, we don't jump out, we jump into the battle. And thus we're still bound in the world and rooted in the present, she says on 209. That said, we are in the quiet of the storm, but still in a storm. Thinking is a storm, and yet it's also the quiet of the storm. We are, she will say, in the place of an arbiter and judge. She says, in this gap between past and future, we find our place in time when we think. That is, we're sufficiently removed from the past and future to be relied on to find out their meaning, to assume the position of umpire, of arbiter and judge over the manifold, never-ending affairs of human existence in the world, never arriving at a final solution, but ready with ever new answers to the questions of what it may all be about. And so in this battlefield, in this gap, in this quiet of the storm, we can think. She ends this chapter with a few really important, beautiful points. One is that the great works in history, the great acts, the great thoughts, the great books, the great poems, are those who owe their relative permanence to the fact of being born in the small, inconspicuous track of non-time, which their authors thought had beaten between an infinite past and an infinite future. What she's saying is all great works are works written in this nowhere, in this battlefield, and they have their greatness, their timelessness in the fact that they're written in a timeless moment. This timelessness is not eternity. It's not some single nunc stans that's standing now that lives forever, but it is an island of truth, not of truth, but of meaning. I'll pick up on a conversation I think we had 2 weeks ago about method that Jerry Cohn and I had. And I talked about, a little bit trying to think about a method, and Arendt here says, there's not a method, right? Nor is there a criteria. But there's a basic assumption. And the basic assumption, she says, is that the thread of tradition is broken, that we can't bring, we can't find a kind of metaphysical whole, that whether it's religion or tradition or family, there's not one tradition and one thread that holds the past and the present and the future together. And the loss of this, it doesn't destroy the past, but it does destroy the continuity of the past, the present, and the future. And what that leaves us is what she calls the fragmented past. This is an idea that she explores in a number of places, including in her essay on Walter Benjamin, and also in the essay on tradition in Between Past and Future, but in many other places as well. And the idea here is that we still read the past, but not for the rules it tells us, or the norms or the morals. We no longer can take the past as determinative, as dispositive. And so we're left without any disposition. And that's what she calls living freely and thinking without banisters. We don't have the banisters of tradition that will tell us what to do. And yet we can, in the past, find fragments, pearls that are worth diving for. This is a metaphor of Benjamin's that she embraces. And so she'll cite Shakespeare and Auden here at the end to talk about how one dives into the past and pulls up fragments that don't fit into a coherent story that is dispositive for us, but yet are meaningful. And by bringing them up and finding these rich and strange fragments, these pearls, we can save them and we can make them meaningful and build a kind of world, or begin to build a new common world in which these fragments are shared as shared heritages. She cites the poem first by Auden. The glacier knocks in the cupboard, the desert sighs in the bed, and the crack in the teacup opens a lane to the land of the dead. There is, you pull out these fragments, these cracks into the past, and we have a lane to the land of the dead. And that dead will not tell us what to do, but we can find things in it that are meaningful, and we can wonder at them, wonder at what you've missed, and we can make them our own. And when we do, we make them worthy of being remembered, which is why she can then cite Auden saying in prose, some books are undeservedly forgotten, right? None are undeservedly remembered. When we pull something from the past, it's because it's meaningful, and that makes it deserved. And so this section ends with this claim that there is a kind of, okay, I'm going to say something that's going to, so again, not a method, not a criteria, but a way of proceeding, pearl diving, close reading, as what I was talking about 2 weeks ago when I mentioned this. I don't know what you call it. If it's not a method, maybe a skill, maybe an approach, a way of approaching the past, a way of approaching things that is consonant with the death of tradition. And thinking is to be in this battlefield, in this nowhere that is temporarily not out of the world, but in this battlefield in which we pull the past into the present, and also think the future, and do battle there and try and make this moment meaningful. I take it that to be where this ends up. There's a postscript of a few pages, which is truly rich and hard to summarize. But basically, the first part that we have to understand is that willing and judging, which are going to be the topics of what she calls book 2 of this study, are like thinking in that they're mental activities and thus invisible and withdraw from the world, and yet more so than thinking, concerned with the world because they deal with particulars. Now, remember, thinking also is still in the world insofar as it thinks in language and thus in metaphor and thus is tied to the world. But more so and more particularly, willing and judging are. She says that thinking is not simply a preparation for judging and willing. Thinking itself is a freedom, and it reminds us of the problem of freedom, which also is the problem of willing. insofar as willing is simply the freedom to will, not because thinking tells you what to will, but simply it's what you will. And so there's a radical freedom to willing, which we have to make sense of. As free and spontaneous, the will was discovered, and its discovery has a history. And for Arendt, that history begins with St. Paul in Christianity, and the letter to the Romans, where Paul says, I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing I hate. And this is the sort of the power, the sort of antinomy of the will and reason. And thus you have a freedom to say yes or no to reason or to the law. And thus we live in pain, in the pain of being told that we must suppress our will in order to do what is right. I think there's a real, I think one of the, probably the part of this prologue that is most challenging to us today are the last two paragraphs, long paragraphs on page 216, where she talks about progress. And here the idea is that progress is the idea that history tells us what we should judge as right or wrong, namely die Weltgeschichte ist die Weltgericht, ist das Weltgericht. The world history is the court of the world, court of judgment, and thus whatever happens is rational and was meant to be and is right. Arendt once again registers her distrust of progress as an ideology, as a modern ideology that thinks that the world is progressing and getting better. We have to think how to judge freely outside of progress and outside of success. And thus she ends this whole book on thinking with the line of Cato: the victorious cause pleased the gods, but the defeated one pleases Cato. Namely, that we don't have to think that what is good or what is rational. That thinking and judging are not about what is true and not about what is successful. They come down to a matter of taste. She says this in another way in the end of the essay on the crisis in culture, where she cites another line, I think Cicero this time, where she says that I would rather be wrong with my friends and Plato than right with his enemies. Again, the point is that for her, judgment is not about right or wrong. It's not about progress. It's about taste. And taste is always something that we develop in a tradition, amongst friends, in a culture, in something that is cultivated. And that judgment thus depends upon not reason or logic or truth, but on a tradition, on a cultivated field. And in a time of the break of tradition, it's not surprising that we suffer a crisis of judgment. And there is a real question of how one judges absent a tradition. And I think that's the sort of question that Arendt is reaching towards at the end of this postscript. All right. I'll stop there. I think I actually realized I talked a little longer than usual, but these are the very rich last few chapters of this section. And a reminder that there are two ways to engage in our conversation now. One is through the chat, which I see is already quite active. Please be respectful of everybody in the chat. And the second is to go down to the reactions button on the bottom of your Zoom screen and click on raise hand and raise your hand, and I will call on you in the order in which you raise your hands, and we can hear your voice and hear your thoughts, and I'll respond to the extent I can. So first question is James Kybert. Welcome, James.
Thank you, Roger. I was loving the pearl diving story. And I was writing it down. Pull past into the present, and could you explore that a little more and clarify for me?
Yeah, so I can't, were you with us, James, when we read the Walter Benjamin essay in Men in Dark Times, or did you join us after that? I can't remember.
I joined after that.
Okay. So you know,
Should I go to that, Walter? I'm writing it down.
Her book, Men in Dark Times, there's an essay on Walter Benjamin. She explores this idea much more fully there. It's an idea I don't want to say takes from Benjamin, because I mean, they were very close friends before he killed himself. But she credits him with this idea. And I think thinks of it always in connection with him. But the basic idea is that with the break in tradition, which she argues happens around, well, with the rise of totalitarianism. Why is that a break in tradition? Because with totalitarianism, the basic understanding of Western thought and history, namely that there's a moral law, or that there is a morality, has been broken. It has been broken by the rise of totalitarian movements that make the law a logical derivation of either racial superiority or class superiority. And the willingness and ability of people to fully embrace totalitarian laws that are fully at odds with any kind of Western moral tradition is for her evidence that the power and continuity of the Western tradition has been ruptured, and any attempt to think otherwise is nostalgia. And so the question then becomes, how do we build a world when the world that had largely existed since, she thinks, the Roman times, where tradition was nurtured and the power of the past was developed, and the power, up from the Roman times until the 20th century, people went back to the classics. I mean, if you went to a college, you studied the classics, not just because, they thought reading Greek was interesting, because there was a sense that we lived in part of a world and of a continuity of Greek and classical and even Christian culture, and even for non-Christians. And that world is over. And so the question is, why read the past anymore, right? How do we think of the past as meaningful if it's no longer part of a tradition? And her and Benjamin's answer is that the past still has riches for us. They're not a part of a unitary story that will tell us what to do, but there are riches. And part of what the humanities is today in the world after tradition, what humanities thinking and and even judging are, is reaching back into the past and finding pearls, finding poems, stories, songs, artworks, buildings, and bringing them up to the surface. And when you do so, they change, right? They're not going to be the same. And yet, speaking about them and telling stories about them in ways that try and make them meaningful again. So she cites The Tempest, Will Shakespeare, full fathom 5, thy father lies. I should have James read this. James, you want to read it for us? He's an actor.
What page?
212.
Full fathom 5, thy father lies. Of his bones are coral made. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange.
You read that as if you acted in this before.
I did.
Yeah. Thank you, James.
Nice.
I'm very glad I let you read that and not me. But here's the idea, as Shakespeare mentions it, that when your father's buried deep, and his bones are coral and pearls are eyes, but you can find something in it, but nothing of him doth fade. But rather, your memory of him is lost, but it doesn't fade completely. It suffers a sea change into something rich and strange. And that's extraordinary. That's that way of bringing the past and the lost into the present and letting it change. And she says, that's what I've done here in this book. To take the timeless track of thinking that thinkers beat into the world of space and time, all the people that have talked about thinking, and try and make it meaningful today, change it, but let it be, does not destroy the rich and strange, the pearls, but makes them meaningful today. And so in doing so, you think, but also you judge, right? You judge what is worth saving, what is worth talking about in the past. And in doing so, you make a claim, right? She doesn't say this here, so this is my adding, I think, from other places in her work, but this is me adding. You make a claim that what I've pulled from the past is worth preserving. And thus you've made a claim that what I pulled from the past is part of a tradition that's broken, but we can begin to build into a new tradition in the way I'm talking about it. And, I think it's ambivalent to me whether Arendt wants or thinks there will be a new tradition someday. I think she assumes there will be, but is ambivalent about when and whether that's good. But even if there's not, bringing these things into the present as things we've chosen as judgments of taste to bring in and commented on begins to build a common set of images and stories that begins to create a common world. And that is how you create a common world, and thus a tradition of some sort in a time in which the thread of tradition is broken. So,
Great. Now I am full of responsibility, and I'll go out and do my job.
there you go. That's why it's important to bring Shakespeare and not just Shakespeare, but the Maori and the Chesapeake, the Cherokee, and everything else into the present, and find what we love about them, and make them real for us today.
Amen.
All right, Clara, you're gonna read some poetry for us, Clara?
No, sir, it's not my specialty.
Okay.
Though I really love poetry and literature, of course. But I only write, short stories.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you, James. Professor Roger, one remark that I really like your puppet, the puppet that you have besides you, the little man you have there on top of your desk.
That's Friedrich Nietzsche.
Ay, tan lindo.
Yeah.
So nice, so nice. Hello, Nietzsche. Okay. And the second is that if you can help me and throw light in this, if the thinking ego wants to understand reality, yes, and knowing that in political emergencies, thinking ceases to be a political marginal activity, what is the connection between thinking and responsibility, sir?
Well, yeah, you know, do we have, I take it you're asking the question of whether we have a responsibility to think. And
yes, that's my question.
And there's a lot in that question. Because Arendt does think that all human beings have the capacity to think. She thinks that most won't, not just because the thinking is hard and it's not usually remote, you know, doesn't have many advantages to it. But she does think that when we encounter people who do think and they make an impression on us, they can motivate us to think as well. You know, so who has a responsibility to think, if anybody? A response to answer, who is answerable for thinking or not? You know, it's an excellent question. Did Eichmann have a responsibility to think? Arendt thinks he should be put to death for what he did, not for who he was, but for what he did. But she doesn't, and she says that maybe if he had thought, he wouldn't have done what he did. But as far as I know, nowhere does she say he had a responsibility to think. I mean, it would have been nice if he did. You know, she says that we all have in us an urge to think, an urge to move beyond the everyday, but she doesn't moralize it, at least not that I can think of. I would, and so that's Arendt, as far as I understand Arendt, if I get her right. From my point of view, and not that you care what my point of view is, but I don't think we have a responsibility to think. I do think that thinking is like being alive. I do believe that. I think thinking is like a battlefield. I think thinking is what makes life worth living, at least for people who love to think. And so for those of us who feel that way, I feel a personal responsibility to teach others to think, and to the extent that's possible, at least make the effort to think with them and inspire more thinking. And that's what teaching is. So, but that's a call that some people have. It's a response, an answer, right? A responsibility is just a call, a response. Those of us who feel called to think and thus do have, well, we have to answer the call, but I don't think everybody has to. And I don't think it's something you can demand of everybody. I think everyone can, but I don't think you should demand it of everybody. I'll tell you, I'm sure that some people are going to disagree with me on that, and I'm happy to hear the disagreements. I don't see it as a moral imperative.
Professor Roger, and do you think that, well, according to Arendt, you have, or one has to be responsible for what I think? I mean, yeah, Clara has to be responsible for what Clara's think.
I don't know what it mean to be responsible for what you think. Responsible is to, like, it's a response. It's an answer. You know, to the extent Clara thinks, she has a responsibility to be in conversation with herself and to try and be true to herself, not let herself be out of tune with herself. Certainly, that Arendt would say, and I would agree. But I don't know what it would mean if she doesn't think. Is she abdicating her responsibility? She's not. I mean, I think Arendt would say, and again, this is going to be very controversial, she's not fully living, and thus she's not fully living as a human being, which is controversial. But Arendt thinks that not all human beings have to fully live as human beings in order to be treated as human beings, right? We should still treat us all as human, even if we don't actualize and fulfill our humanity, because what makes us human is our capacity to actualize our humanity, not that we actually do it. At least that's how I'm pretty confident of that reading of Arendt's. I guess I'm going to still be hesitant to say that there's a responsibility to think. I don't think Arendt thinks everyone wants to or will, and that doesn't make them inhuman. It means they're not fulfilling their humanity, but it doesn't make them inhuman, because it's human to not fulfill your humanity for Arendt.
That's right. Thank you, Professor Roger.
Yep. Jeff.
Hello. Yeah, yesterday as I was finishing this up, I just like a question occurred to me that was like pretty far out there, but but we're at the end, and I just it's actually an application, which is something we don't usually do that much of. So with that teaser, I'll just launch into. So basically, the 19 I really liked. There's a little spot there on 199 where she talks about, you know, sort of the what I would think of sort of the laboratories of, and then she's what she refers to as the way scientists form a community that is distributed in place while they're thinking about things that don't have concepts, that don't have place. And I thought that was really nice, because it leverages the political, you know, thread that runs through all of our. Then then we go to 20, and then she says, she does the same thing she does in part 3, right? She says, I'm gonna change the question now. I put the question right there at the title of the part, but now we're gonna go, instead of where we think, we're gonna say when we think. And I found it kind of muddled. But then around 205, something occurred to me, because I'd read this article in the New Yorker, and I thought, oh, here's kind of an application, which namely was the article was about reparations in the form of where do Black people's formerly enslaved peoples, mainly, but also during Jim Crow, where do their graves don't tend to get much respect, right? Where are they? And part of the article, which is very I usually try to take a pretty dry eye to these kind of things, was, you know, when they actually moved graves, and they had to basically dug the people up and then put someplace else. And so I thought, well, what would that be like for people, for their descendants, you know? And of course, that's a lot of the reparations controversy, is, you know, how much say do descendants have? Now, I'm not want to you know, try and solve that here in 5 or 10 minutes. What I was trying to figure out is how can how can Arendt inform the way we approach reparations? Because that is definitely one of those things. Is like we don't know where to begin, you know. But it really, and I felt confirmed in that, which is why I decided to ask the question anyway. By the part that we've already covered there on 205, when with the poems there, it deliberately, it's talking directly about you know, decaying corpses basically, and so that is so just something about when they disinter a body, basically that is a way of reaching into the past, which is very, very real, right? um, and uh, and so you get that temporal sense, but you get it in a way that you can see that's very, very public, as the cemetery is. And so there's a connection between the where and the when that just seems very evocative to me. So anyway, but again, I'm not expecting like an answer. I'm just thinking, how can we work Arendt into this, so that, because there's a case where we're sort of desperately figuring out a ground to stand, or where we can find a perspective to tackle such a huge problem. Although it's, and on one hand, it's very, very real, concrete. People are there, and not just the dead, but their descendants. But then we also have the you know, the thinking of it. It's like it's very, we don't know. So we're gonna take just about anything, because
Yeah.
it's a hard problem.
So, you know, I don't have an answer to the question of Arendt on reparations. You know, I think you're mentioning, you know, cemeteries and graveyards is apt. These are places of memory. To the extent that some cemeteries have been lost or built over or destroyed intentionally or unintentionally, often intentionally. Um, uh, the kind of acts of pearl diving we've been talking about, and going back and resurrecting fragments of history is deeply important. Um, uh, um, yes, so I think that's right. And I think that, you know, one of the interesting aspects of pearl diving is that you can dive in Shakespeare and you can dive in Cato, but you can also dive in you know, indigenous cultures and places that we haven't been part of the mainstream tradition for a long time. And that's an important addition and corrective to the tradition that's now broken. So that's one of the beauties of what's so much of what's going on in the cultural world today, is that, you know, you can go and write about the importance of teaching your children Plato and taking them to see Delphi. And on the same trip, you can take them to go see you know, Turkish ruins or indigenous ruins in, you know, caves in Eastern Turkey, and explore a completely different cultural tradition and find meaning in both. And I think that's part of what's really open for us today in our age. And then the question is, to what extent, when one does it, one speaks to more than a common culture, just beyond your own self or your own, you know, people. Is there a way of creating common cultures beyond identities that actually build some sort of common world? So, you know, once you do that and you unearth some of these histories, which are judgments of taste about what's worth being unearthed and what's not, you do also have to make decisions about how to go forward, right? And that's a will. And that could include something like reparations. But for Arendt, that's more of a free thought than even a matter of taste. So I don't know if I have much more to say on it, Jeff, but I think it's those are important questions. Thank you. Stephen Most, you're up next.
Roger. I'm struck by the fact that this book, Thinking, begins with reference to several Shakespeare villains, and then at the end quotes The Tempest. And then if you think about her work at large, there are many references to stories, Billy Budd, to the stories that should have been told about the Holocaust. You see her own pearl diving at the center of her work. And of course, the thinking is about meaning, and it's in stories that meaning is encapsulated, meaning is preserved. And it seems to me that her whole notion of judgment, which is founded on taste, is also quite germane to the search for stories, whether they're theatrical stories or poetry or fiction. And that seems to me really central to Hannah Arendt's work, that in a sense, she's a thinker, but she's also a pearl diver and a storyteller. And I wonder if you would speak about it.
Well, the first thing to say is yes. Remember the central guiding thread of the whole book on thinking is the claim that in thinking we don't search for truth, we seek to make meaning, right? She says it in many places, but on page 15, the need of reason is not inspired by the quest for truth, but by the quest for meaning, and truth and meaning are not the same. Meaning is largely contained in stories. Not just stories, but thinking, insofar as it thinks, is striving for what? Not for truth, she's going to say, but for meaning. What have we learned about this aim for meaning that's not confined by truth? Well, it's out of order. It's not constrained by the world. It's not it's invisible. It works in metaphors. It desenses and thus generalizes. And it seeks to find to find general stories, right, which are always going to be cutting off the rough edges and finding what is meaningful, and so it's it always is going to in a sense tell a story, and I think that's absolutely central to what she means by thinking. So on page 176, she'll say the quest for meaning, which relentlessly dissolves and examines anew all accepted doctrines and rules, can at any moment turn against itself and produce a reversal of the old values and declare the contrary as new values. So another aspect of meaning is that insofar as it is constantly destroying what is and what's old, it opens the sense to a kind of nihilism, and thus thinking can be deeply dangerous in that sense. Meaning dissolves doctrines and rules. Stories, what are they? They're not what they mean is always hard to say. And so, yeah, I think Arendt's work as a thinker is always about dissolving, attacking doctrines, stories, telling stories, making meaning, struggling for meaning, striving for meaning. And it's not confined by or constrained by a morality or an ethics. But that doesn't mean that it's completely free from judgment. I mean, when she writes The Origins of Totalitarianism, she says very clearly, I'm writing this to try and destroy totalitarianism, you know? But how does she do it? She doesn't do it by simply condemning totalitarianism. She does it by trying to understand totalitarianism, look for its origins, try and make sense of it, make it meaningful. Only by making it meaningful and understanding it as a response to, you know, racism, loneliness, the death of the nation state, imperialism, and all the different aspects of it that she describes in that book, can you seek to understand it, and in doing so, make it meaningful, and thus allow you to fully resist it and reject it for what it is, because you understand it. And you know, same with Eichmann. Again, she thinks Eichmann is a walking disaster who should be erased from the face of the earth. That's her judgment of him at the end of the book. But in making that judgment, she makes an incredible effort to understand and make him meaningful. And only in doing that can you understand why he's so dangerous, she thinks, not just because he killed people. Lots of people have killed, but because he fully became an instrument of genocide thoughtlessly and with banality. And because he's a symbol for that, and because he did what he did in that way, he has to be wiped off the face of the earth. So, you know, for her, you have to, she turned Eichmann into a story. She turned totalitarianism into a story. She turned them into meanings. And just because they're meaningful doesn't mean they're good. There are meaningful things that are awful. But the search for meaning is what thinking and the urge to think requires.
Thank you, Roger. I have to go at this point, but I'll just point out that for Arendt, Eichmann was a comic character like Brecht's Arturo Ui and Chaplin's The Great Dictator. So she had not only a moral response to him, but an aesthetic one.
A more, yes, but I mean her comic in the sense of comically awful,
right?
Not just like pure comedy,
right?
Yes.
So thank you very much. I have to leave, and this
No
is a
worries.
great session.
Yep. Bye, Benjamin.
Hi, Roger. So I feel like I maybe have some definitions crossed, or maybe I'm thinking about this in the right way. But my question is, so saying that truth isn't necessarily what we're out for, but rather meaning and meaningful stories, and doing pearl diving to find things of value which appeal to our taste, from which we sort of build these meaningful stories that let us understand the world. Is that different from the kind of lying the truth, or whatever we called it, the actions that a totalitarian government would take? Is this like repeating what they do in order to give us some defense against them, or what? No. So what's the difference there?
The difference is that totalitarian rulers lie in order to create a consistent story based in an ideology. So if your ideology is that Aryans are the chosen people, and therefore anyone else who's the chosen people or claims to be the chosen people not only contests with the Aryans, but is an affront to them, but they are actually and that we will show that everything they do causes all the problems in the world and they have to be eliminated. That's and you yes you pull dive and you pick up history and you turn it into your argument, but again alongside a coherent narrative that makes people feel comfortable and happy if they're people who adhere to that narrative.
Sure.
The kind of pearl diving that Benjamin and Arendt engage in is not designed to all conform to and prove one logical story. It's finding things that are worth preserving and telling stories about, not in the name of certainly not in the name of any ideology. Now, I mean, there's an interesting caveat, not caveat, but an interesting aspect to that, which is to the extent you're a Marxist, to just use an example, and all the stories you pull out are designed to show the awfulness of the bourgeoisie and the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, then you're pull diving in accord with an ideology, right? Just like the Nazi ideology pull dives in accord with an ideology. And you're seeking to tell a unified totalitarian story. And from Arendt's point of view, that's dangerous. Insofar as you're someone, even if you're not a Marxist, but you believe that, the world is on a trajectory of progress that will lead to justice, and the arc of justice, the arc of the world bends towards justice, the arc of history bends toward justice. Again, that kind of a progressive story is also an ideological story, which is why Arendt is so suspicious of progress narratives. What she talks about, what she calls legen taeonta, right? Saying what is, has no overriding coherence to it. It's just saying what is. And so that's the big difference.
Okay. I think I understand. So the inverse of this kind of pearl diving is saying, regardless of my taste, regardless of what I actually find, I know what I'm looking for. You're not pearl diving in that you might come across something of value and incorporate it into your world. It's like, I already know what I'm, quote, going to find, end quote, and anything that
I may find something new, but I know what its value is.
Right. And if it doesn't fit with my, for instance, Nazi or Marxist ideology, then I don't pick it up. Forget it. It's
either I fit it or I destroy it.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep. Joe.
Yeah, hi. I've got a question relating to a section on page 216.
Last page, yeah.
Yeah, and where Arendt is talking about the relationship between theory and practice. And I wondered, she's talking about how, she says here, and this is of some relevance to a whole set of problems by which modern thought is haunted, especially to the problem of theory and practice, and to all attempts to arrive at a halfway plausible theory of ethics. I just wondered if you could possibly share something about that at all.
Well, actually, yeah. I mean, that's almost exactly what I was just talking about with Ben in the previous question with Benjamin. She's talking about Kant, and the idea that you can't really teach judgment, which is how you deal with and judge particulars. But what she says is that for Kant, you have something called reason or regulative ideas, which don't ever tell you exactly what is true, but lead you towards the truth. You're supposed to judge according to some sort of regulative ideas or some kind of rationality. That fits with the kind of judgment according to ideologies or ideologies of progress that you find in Hegel or Marx or race theories, or some social justice theories, in the sense that there's a claim that we are supposed to pick up those things in history and value those things in history that lead us in the right direction, that lead us towards justice, lead us towards communism, lead us towards a master race, whatever it is, depending on your ideology. And so for her, this sort of the idea that we judge according to some sort of regulative ideas or reason leads us into this, you said, the problem of theory and practice, which is, should theory govern practice? And that's what she thinks people like Hegel and Marx have brought to the world, which is the priority of theory over practice, the theory over the world, in which the whole premise is that we have to see the world as rational. And she thinks that's quite dangerous. Does that help or not?
Yeah, no, that does help. Thank you.
Okay. Vivian.
Sorry, I've made such a confused scribble of these few observations or understandings that I have, or whatever they are. And they, in my case, they don't sound like questions, but they are, in the sense that, you know, I'm not an academic and I do love to be corrected. So go ahead. I also have a real question as well. First, the simple question is actually where Arendt quotes Paul Valéry, and excuse me, where she, what am I saying? Where is that? What page is that? Where does she quote him? And then she gives a Tracy, and I don't understand her.
It's probably 201. Yeah.
Sorry.
It's page 201.
Yeah. Okay. Hang on. I don't see a quotation on page 201. She discusses him, but there is an actual quote from.
Okay.
Where she says, "Oh, you know what? I'll come back to it when I find it." I mean, she quotes. Oh, here it is. I'm sorry. It's not Valerie. It's where she quotes Auden's "The glacier knocks in the cupboard, the desert sighs in the bed, and the crack in the teacup opens a lane to the land of the dead." And then underneath she puts, this is a question, because here's where I don't understand her language of thinking, she says, or to put in the same in prose, some books are undeservedly forgotten, none are undeservedly remembered. Now that statement I understand, but I don't understand how she says to put the same in prose. How is that the same as what Auden is saying in prose? That's a question, and then I want to make some other questions.
Well, when she says the glacier knocks in the cupboard and the desert sighs in the bed, right? And the crack in the teacup opens a lane to the land of the dead. What she's saying is that, you know, when you see a crack in the teacup, right? And you make it meaningful, the meaning you bring to it, the land of the dead, is deservedly remembered. You know, what these things make you, you know, when you I don't know, the glazier knocks in the cupboard and then I guess cracks the teacup, right? The desert size in the bed, is that the death? I think if I'm getting it, these things bring us memories that we make meaningful, and all of
Okay.
them are deserved.
Okay. All right. I just couldn't understand that sort of conceptual leap of, putting the same in prose, but I sort of get it now. Okay. Then just in response to some of these ideas, and also what people have just said and asked before me. One, for example, this issue of reparations, and I think who mentioned that first, I think said something about we don't know what to do, or it's confusing, or whatever. I'm not sure that reparations are confusing or that we don't know what to do. I believe that reparations, like material reparations, often when you think of reparations, you're thinking of land, material, or money. To make taking away good again. And this is actually, I think, it's incompatible with capitalist economic market forces. And I think that if there's any reason, if there's any way in which we don't know what to do or how to do it, it's because it's actually incompatible with capitalism. And if you are a Marxist, a communist, a socialist, it's not that confusing in terms of what to do or how you would make reparations. Just think that capitalism will not admit that in any way. Then the second thing is this idea of, or if I don't know if it's her idea or responsibility to think, but surely if there is any responsibility to think, and as you said, since not everybody thinks, not everybody can be expected to have any of this responsibility. So I would think that surely it depends what you actually do in your life, not in terms of whether you're a painter or a writer, but perhaps whether you're a person like Eichmann, whatever his job description was, in a position of power where you affect so directly other people and their livelihoods, welfare, and their fate, whether they live or die. So surely in that sense, it is an indictment if you don't think, because it means you don't have a shred of responsibility for that either. So I think it has to do with that. It's depends on what you do in life, in the world, in your action. Then
Marian, I think you're right. Although here's what I'd say is, to a certain degree, most of the officials that we hire in the government, I mean, the expectation is that they won't think, right? That they'll just do what they're told or do their job.
Yeah, but I don't think that, that's understood. I don't think that it gets rid of the idea that even if there's an expectation that you don't think as a politician, and even in fact, if you don't think, however, if you don't think, but you end up acting in a certain way, then this issue comes into play. You see,
I think you're right. I'm just not sure that it's a moral responsibility. It may be a political responsibility, not a moral responsibility.
Well, it's got to surely be related to ideas of judgment and therefore moral responsibility as well. But maybe all of that is a matter of degree, depending on the case, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other thing I want to say is, of course, there's all this pearl diving, that some of how it's been talked about today, it makes it sound like foraging, but it's not to do with foraging. It's to do with perhaps remembering what there once was and preserving something, but only in the act of forging something new. This is, it's not, and I think, and here's the sort of question or observation. It's so fantastic to me it's almost as if Nietzsche and Benjamin and Arendt and maybe everyone that followed are the the grandchild or the grandchildren of the great German romantic idea. It's also related to sort of romanticism, and through romanticism also expressionism, which and its longing to realize or express in an unmediated way. And the unmediated way is another way of saying being in the present or whatever, or that part of the present, or in that gap between past and future. And it's so and I said, I mean, maybe if that's right, maybe it's or reasonable, maybe it's so obvious that it's even absurd to say, but to have a very simple, in a way, illustration of this. And of course, Arendt, and no self-respecting person would really uncritically quote Richard Wagner as opposed to William Shakespeare, but it's Richard Wagner in his, which used to be my most favorite when I was much younger, beloved opera in the whole world, the Meistersinger of Nuremberg. It illustrates this whole German idea of learning something in order to reject it, words that you actually used yourself a few minutes ago, but not quite in the same way. And this is illustrated not only in the actual text of the libretto, in spelling that out, but also in the song that Wolfgang von Eschenbach composes. And there's always this emphasis with this, with the preservation, with the pearl diving, with the don't destroy the corals. When you make something in a completely new form that is a departure, that moves us along as human beings in our lives.
I think that's really well said. And that is, I mean, whether I'm not sure foraging, or I'm not sure I know the difference foraging or pearl diving, but okay. I think preserving and holding on to the past in ways that make it meaningful, so that you can both understand it, but also resist it, is.
Yes, exactly. Understand in order to reject, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
You know,
comprehension is the attentive facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be.
That's right. Like Nietzsche and God with his Christianity, because he was such a deep religious Christian. And then finally, if I could just say, you know, I wonder, and here's also something that might sound absurd, I wonder what a brain like Arendt's could have looked like without the advent of Nazi totalitarianism, which formed her entire life and the directions in which she took her inquiry and her thoughts and her writing. And it's so amazing to me also that everything she writes, or, you know, all of these things, the subjects that she chooses, the willing, the judgment, all of this, yes, it all relates to philosophy that's gone before her, but it's so informed by that experience. You know, really, there's no way of existing for her in any way without that entire context is almost too weak a word, you know, that entire reality of what was, what happened because of that.
Thank you, Vivian. And I know there's some other questions, but we're a little past time, so I'm sorry about that. But I'm glad so many people are engaged. The good news is we are moving forward in this book. So last time we read this book, we only ended here. Now we're going on and continuing with the section on willing, which I'm very much looking forward to. So does anyone know, has anyone looked? I should look on our website. Are we meeting next week? We're not, because it's the Hannah Arendt Center conference next week. So we will not be meeting next week, but the week after. Let me just check. I hope all of you are either going to come and join us, or come and listen on the webcast to the conference next week, which is October 15th. And October 22nd, we start with chapter 1, The Philosophers of the Will, sections 1 through 3. So that will be for October 22nd. I wish you all a great 2 weeks. I hope to see you at the conference, either virtually or in person, and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.